All right, welcome everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr. I'm a professional landscape photographer, printmaker. I'm also a teacher, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of Canson Infinity, presenting this talk today called Color Management, Understanding Color Management and Profiles. I've been a Canson Infinity ambassador for, over a decade now. And so this is really a lot of fun for me to share with you principles and tips and techniques on how to make your prints look better, as well as understand the whole printing process. I'm a firm believer that the more you know, the more you learn, then the more you can engage with the creative aspects of photography and printing specifically. And so that's what my goal today here is to somewhat demystify color management. And I say demystify because it seems to be a consensus that it's this mysterious thing that's hard to understand. And it's really not that difficult to understand. There are lots of moving parts, and that's part of, I think, the challenge. But I want to explain what color management is, why it's important, and as I said, the various parts and how they work together to give you a good grasp, I believe, of what color management is all about and how to use it, how to make sure that you've got at least the basic parts of it understood and you got all the right things checked off. This is not going to be an in-depth discussion of color management that could take many books written on color and things like that, but I think it'll give you a good grasp. I'm also going to share some technical info that I think will help you to understand it from a conceptual standpoint. Again, I'm a firm believer in understanding core concepts because then you can build on that and it makes it easier to troubleshoot or to have a clearer picture of what's going on under the hood, as it were, with these amazing digital tools that we have today. And of course, the amazing paper that we can leverage from Canson Infinity to make our prints look as beautiful and as wonderful as we would like them to. You can share your questions in the chat. There'll be a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. I'm also joined today by Jane Dixon. She'll be in the chat as well. She's the VP of Sales and Marketing for Canson, so she'll be helping me answer some questions. If you have any questions about paper supply or where to buy papers or anything like that, she'll be the resident expert for those kinds of things. Okay. With that said, if you have any questions during the chat, of course, you can post those. And if I see that they're relevant, I'll answer those. But I want to try to make sure that I get through everything that I want to share so that we get too sidetracked and keep it under the hour here. All right, so let's get started. So what is color management and why is it important? And first question, yes, the recording will definitely be available. No problems there. We record all of our webinars here. And so for those who don't make it or want to watch it again, absolutely. And actually, I'm glad you asked that because even though you can watch it again, I suggest if you see any information that you want to jot down, write it down or take a screenshot because you may want to reference that later. Okay, so what is color management? Well, it's essentially a system to ensure that you have color accuracy across all of your devices, all of the devices in your workflow. And of course, this is crucial for photographers, especially when we're printing, because we want to maintain this color accuracy, right? We want to make sure that what we capture in the field, those colors are represented at the end with as least amount of change possible. So as I said, color management helps your print match what you see on screen, and that reflects or helps to make sure that your vision is preserved, as it were. You get predictable and accurate color reproduction, right? That's important. We create and maintain consistency and confidence, and that's really important because the more confident you are in your system, the more you can rely on it. And again, the more you can trust that it's going to do what you want it to do, and you can focus more on the creative aspects of photography. And the other thing is, oops, missed one there. The other thing is that if you get this consistency and accuracy, you can avoid frustrations. We're all familiar with those, right? Things like wasted paper, wasted ink, of course, wasted time. We can minimize these frustrations to a high degree. And so I can pretty much, I mean, I can tell you over 10 years, my frustration has been slowly coming more and more and more down. In fact, it was really at the beginning where I felt like I wasn't really in control of all the aspects of it. And now I don't really get frustrated at all unless there's something that catches me by surprise. I spend more of my time thinking about how to craft a better print, how to craft a better image. And you can get there. It is completely possible. Again, you just have to have these all these parts in their right place. So what's the challenge? The challenge is that color management relies on many different devices that you may have in your workflow, right? You've got your input, that's your camera. A camera has its own way of capturing color. It has its own gamut. I'm going to use this word gamut a few times, but to define it now, gamut is simply a measurement of how many colors a device can reproduce. So the larger the gamut, the more colors it can reproduce. The largest gamut that we know of is human vision, of course. That's the total number of colors that we can see. That's the largest gamut. And then each device will have a different sub-gamut of that, if you will. So a camera has a particular gamut. Then we've got our editing application together with our computer, your display that has a different gamut than your camera. And of course, we've got the printer, but specifically the paper, because it's the paper that determines how many colors we're going to have in the end. And each paper has its own specific gamut, how many colors it can reproduce, some papers more than others. And so you can see the challenge here is that with all of these different devices having their own language, so to speak, we need a way to be able to translate between these devices, something that can make sure that our information flows through the devices, preserving the right colors, or if you want to use a language analogy, that English is translated properly into French, French is translated properly into Spanish, etc., with the same meaning maintained throughout the workflow. And that's where ICC Profiles come in. ICC just stands for International Color Consortium. It's an organization that standardizes different color ideas for the industry. And a profile is nothing more than it's a file that describes how a particular device will reproduce color, or how it reproduces color. So we have a profile, or we can have several profiles for our camera that'll interpret the sensor data. We can have a profile for our monitor that'll be a profile that best describes how your particular monitor describes color. And as I said before, a profile for each paper, because each paper is unique. So just to dispel something right now, you don't profile your printer, because the printer is not the final output. The printer is just a tool that puts the ink onto the paper, but the paper determines the colors and the contrast and the dynamic range. That's what we need a profile for, not for the printer. Now, I also want to talk about color spaces. This is another conceptual idea that you should have in mind. A color space is nothing more than a predefined gamut. It's a standardized way of talking about different ways of using color, of course, with our digital devices. It's like a reference, if you will. Another analogy you can think of is that a color space is like a playing field, and the playing field determines how many colors you can use in that playing field, as well as how much tonal range you have from white to black, as well as bit depth. So you'll notice here that the horseshoe shape is visible light, visible colors to humans, roughly. And each one of these triangles is a different color space that's standardized. Here you see that the smallest triangle is what is known as the sRGB color space. You might be familiar with this. You may have seen it in applications and so forth. But the sRGB color space is the standard color space for the internet, everything that goes online. And you can see that the sRGB color space is a lot smaller than the total colors that we can see, or even some of these other larger color spaces. So sRGB, one color space, You may have heard of wide gamut monitors, monitors that have a larger gamut. That basically means that they have a larger color space, sometimes defined as Adobe RGB. That's one common color space for monitors. Another one is Display P3, that's used by Apple. And then this largest color space is Pro Photo, and that is used by Lightroom because that's the largest color space. It preserves all of the colors from your camera, and then you can compress the colors from that point based on where you are going to use your file, whether you're going to print it or put it online or what have you. Now, let me jump into an application here, which will give you a 3D representation of color spaces. And I think this will give you a nice visualization and idea of what we're talking about when we talk about color spaces. So here we're looking at the Pro Photo RGB color space in 3 dimensions. And so you can see now how big it is. This is roughly equated to how many colors we can see with the human eye. And you can see that at the top we have our lightest colors, and at the bottom we have our darkest colors, or black and white at the top, and then all of these different colors. Now I'm going to open up another color space here, which is the sRGB color space, and then I'm going to fade back this Pro Photo RGB color space. And so now you can see how much smaller the sRGB color space is compared to the Pro Photo RGB color space. All right. So that just means that if you have an image from your camera that has some reds in this area, those reds have to be compressed down into the smaller color space before you can share it online. Okay. Now let's talk about, I'll show you in terms of monitors, right? I'm going to hide back the Adobe 98 color space. So now this larger shape that's surrounding the sRGB color space would be Adobe 98, and that's what you would get if you purchase a wide gamut monitor. I'll talk about monitors more a little bit later, but you can see the difference there, right? So these different color spaces can show different colors, and here you see exactly what's going on. And later I'll come back to this and I'll show you the color space for different Canson papers and how they fit into this wider comparison here between color spaces. And I'll answer the questions on black and white a little bit later when we get into the printer, so not a problem. Okay, so let's jump back into our presentation here. So the first thing that you want to make sure you have properly set up is your monitor. Now, why your monitor? Because your monitor is the reference for everything that you do. Everything you're going to evaluate through your monitor. And so that needs to be, you need to make sure that that is properly calibrated, because then you can make decisions about everything else. Now, why calibrate your monitor? Well, if you don't trust your monitor, then it's hard to know whether what you're looking at is real or not, right? You want to be able to trust your monitor, and you want to be able to trust your editing decisions so that when you print, you know that if there's any discrepancy, it's not coming from your monitor, because that's the first thing that you make sure is accurate. And I want to emphasize, you should calibrate every monitor that you use. So if you've got a laptop and a desktop, you want to calibrate them both, because that means that when you move between the two computers, your colors remain as faithful as possible. Even if you've got an Apple computer, a lot of times they say you don't have to calibrate them. I would argue that you should always calibrate the monitor. And it basically makes sure that your whites and your blacks are set properly, there's not too much contrast, and that your grays are neutral. They're not too cool and not too warm. And when you buy a monitor, usually it's using a profile that is not optimized for printing. It's optimized to make your movies and your YouTube and all that look as good as possible, but it's not a reference profile. Now, when it comes to calibrating your monitor, you really don't need to spend a lot of money. You need a calibration device. There are 2 companies that produce calibration devices now. One is Datacolor, and they make a device called the Spider. There's another company used to be called X-Rite. They are now called Calibrite, or at least the company that's making the display calibrators. They're called Calibrite, and they have this display 123. So either one of these will work perfectly fine. They're about $150 roughly. And the reason why you want to own one is because you need to calibrate or should calibrate every few months. They will recommend that you calibrate every month, but I don't calibrate that often, but every 4 to 5 or 6 months, because your monitor will drift a little bit over time. Now, when you are calibrating with one of these devices, the device will come with some software, and the software will guide you through the calibration process. Now, there are some settings, some standard generic settings in the software, regardless of whether you're using the Spider by Datacolor or the Display 123, but there are some settings, and these settings are pretty standard, universal. So one of them is the white point setting, and the white point defines the temperature of your monitor, how cool or warm it is. And I like to go with D65. Some people recommend D50. I find that a little bit too cool. That's cooler. D65 for me is more realistic with how we actually see in the real world and how we evaluate our prints. So I like to use a white point of D65. This luminosity is extremely important. And the reason for that is one of the biggest complaints that I hear from photographers is that their prints are too dark. They don't match what they see on screen. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because if you don't calibrate your monitor and set the luminosity level, your monitor will most probably be very, very bright. And that's because monitors have gotten more powerful over time. And they also come from the factory set at the maximum brightness level, which again looks great for movies and impressing you and those kinds of things, but not really useful when you're referencing against something like a print, which relies on light being reflected off of the paper versus light coming within it, like a monitor has. And so a luminosity level of 100 to 120 candelas, that's what CDM2 stands for, candelas per square meter, or nits is another phrase, that another reference that you'll use here for this. That will lower the brightness of your monitor. If you're used to using a very bright monitor, that might feel a little strange at first, but believe me, you get used to it. Your eyes don't get as fatigued. The monitor is matches much more closely to a viewing environment for your print, and you'll get much better results because now you'll be comparing, you have comparisons between the monitor and the print that are more closely related versus far away, which is what happens when you've got your monitor at its highest brightness level. And then the gamma setting is 2.2. That is just a measure of the brightness of your midtones. So these are just standard settings. Make sure that you have these settings in your calibration software before you start to do the calibration. And then the software and the spectrophotometer, that's this little device here, that will calibrate your monitor, create a profile. It creates a custom profile for your computer that then your operating system uses to display colors on your monitor, giving you a good reference for everything that you do in Lightroom or whatever other application that you use. Oops, went to the beginning. Sorry about that. We get back to where we were. Okay, calibration. Press the wrong button there. So as I mentioned before, right, different monitors, well, most standard monitors, office desktop monitors, inexpensive monitors will be capable of producing color in the sRGB color space. They'll be limited to sRGB. For photography, that's why we always recommend a wide gamut monitor. If you can get one, a wide gamut monitor will give you more colors, which will give you a more accurate reference of the actual colors in your image. There are many manufacturers that make, several manufacturers that make wide gamut monitors. I personally like BenQ. I think they make excellent photography monitors. That's what I use. But you can also get wide gamut monitors from Apple. Apple doesn't use the Adobe 98 color space. They use the Display P3, as I mentioned before, but that's very similar and just as good. That, by the way, includes not only their studio display, but also a lot of the iMacs will support P3. And so that, again, that is essentially a wide gamut monitor. Asus also sells wide gamut monitors, ISO and Dell. So when you shop around, look for wide gamut specification. Make sure that it says Adobe 98 or 99% of Adobe 98. And in the case of Apple, it's going to be P3. Okay, so once you've got your profile for your monitor, and now you know you've got a good reference, I want to back up a little bit and just talk a little bit about profiles for your camera, because this is something that I think is underused. And if you're using something like Lightroom, there's a lot of creative capability just using the profiles that are supplied by Adobe to get different color renditions of your file. So I'm going to jump into Lightroom very quickly here. And here's an image. If I go into the develop module, here on the right-hand side, you'll see this profile section. And this is, again, these are profiles that come with Lightroom. And these profiles are unique to your camera, even though Adobe's profiles all have the same name. So you have Adobe Color, Adobe Landscape, Adobe Portrait, but they're each one of those will change depending on your particular camera, because every camera has a different way of capturing color. But you'll notice that if I switch to Adobe Color, okay, without doing anything else, you'll see that my image lost some of its color. It's not as vivid, not as vibrant. And to get the color looking the way I had it before, I will have to add some vibrance here, something like that. Okay, but if you start with the profile and experiment with the different profiles and try different profiles, you may be able to get the color that you're looking for before you even start to do any editing. And this will give you a purer file, a better quality file, if you will, because you're doing it at the first instance of the editing process. So for example, if I zero out the vibrance here, you'll see that each of these profiles gives me a different look. So I can go to portrait, standard, vivid, and if I go to landscape, right, that one really gives me more color, and I haven't touched the vibrance or saturation at all. In fact, for this particular image, I'm not adding any vibrance or saturation for this image in its finished form, because I'm perfectly happy with the color that the Adobe Landscape profile gives me. And if you click on these over here to the right, you'll see these four rectangles. You'll see that there are many other profiles that Lightroom gives you, and you can experiment with all of these to give you different looks. Now, keep in mind, profiles are not presets. It doesn't change anything, any of the adjustments in the develop module. This is just how the raw file is being interpreted by the file and how it's being rendered, so to speak. So this gives you a lot of potential to, again, start with an image that is closer to what you're looking for before you start to make adjustments here. All right, so those are the profiles in Lightroom. All right, so that's what we have here. And again, this is this is provided by Lightroom. Now, once you are finished editing your image and you're happy with the way it looks, then as you start getting prepared for the printing, you want to do something called soft proofing. And the reason for soft proofing is because that will simulate what the image will look like on a particular paper. Okay, and that's important because not only will it give you a sense of how the colors are going to shift if they do, but it will also allow you to select what is called a rendering intent. So remember I mentioned before when I showed you the color spaces in ColorThink that we have to compress the colors from a larger color space to a smaller one. And there are different methods of doing this. Those are called the rendering intents, and they will change the way the image looks slightly. Soft proofing in Lightroom allows you to select which of the rendering intents will give you a better result, okay? And one thing to keep in mind here, I will mention this again later, but what we're doing here is we're soft proofing with a color profile for the paper that we want to use. So we're not profiling for the printer. It depends on the paper that we're going to use, which is why you have to select the paper that you're going to use when you're soft proofing. So let me jump back into Lightroom. To soft proof in Lightroom, I'm going to press S on my keyboard. That takes me into the soft proof mode. And here on the right, you will see that I have an option to select the profile that I want to soft proof. In other words, what paper do I want to print this on? And then we'll be able to determine which rendering intent works best. Now, how do you get the profiles in here? Well, first you have to go to the Canson website. You go to the ICC Profiles section right over here. I'm going to select my printer, or you select your printer. Let's go with Canon. I'm going to printer model, select printer model. I'm going to go down to the, I'm using an 1100 at the moment. And then here you will see profiles for each of Canson's papers. And if I want to download the ARCH88 profile, click here, click on download. That downloads it to your computer, and then you need to install it into your operating system. I'm not going to cover that specifically here, but at the bottom here, you see there's a couple of videos that show you exactly how to install it. It's pretty straightforward. On the Mac, it needs to go into your library color folder. On Windows, it's actually pretty easy. You just, once you've downloaded the profile, you double click it and Windows will automatically put it into the right place. I'll come back to the media settings here when we get to setting up the printer driver. But these are the profiles. Now, in Lightroom, once you install the profile, you have to do this while Lightroom isn't running, because if Lightroom is running, then it won't register the profile you installed. So you quit Lightroom, or if you don't have it running, make sure you install the profile when Lightroom is not running, or Capture One, or whatever you're using. Then open up Lightroom. And then when you go to the profile section here, and by the way, this profile section here is the same as in the print module. So it accesses the same profiles in Lightroom. You're not going to see the profile here when you install it. You actually have to tell Lightroom to enable it inside of Lightroom. And the way you do that is here at the bottom of this list, you'll see it says Other. You click on Other, and you get this window here that shows all of the profiles that are installed on your computer. Here is the folder, the directory I mentioned before. It's in the library folder, Color Sync Profiles. And then whatever profile you downloaded or you want to have access to in Lightroom, you make sure that it has a checkbox next to it. So you see that I have ARCH88 from Canson Infinity. You can see the CIFA here that is Canson's identifier, CIFA, Canson Infinity Fine Art. IPF Pro 1100 is the name of the printer, and then ARCH88, the paper, and 310 is the weight of the paper. Different weight papers may have a slightly different profile. So I'm going to click on, once it's checked, I click on OK. And now that profile appears here. And you notice that as I change these profiles, my print here, or my soft proof, is going to change ever so slightly. If I go back to ARCH88, you see that it has a different, slightly different look now. To compare the original to the soft proofed version, you press Y, and now you get a sort of a before and after, or the original image without the soft proofing, and the soft proof version over here, or what's called the proof preview. And so you see here that as I change the profile here, that will change depending on the paper. Notice that Platine, you see that the print gets a little bit darker. We get a little bit more contrast because Platine has a higher Dmax. So we're going to get a little more contrast in the image. If I switch this back to ARCH88, it gets a little bit less contrasty. Don't go with the contrast changes here. Don't use that as a reference, because that's really meant just to give you an idea, and it's never going to look this washed out compared to the original. This is just a rough estimate. I'm not extremely crazy about what it does in terms of making it look washed out. But in terms of the color, you see here below the profile, we have the intent, and there are two different ways of compressing the colors from essentially what is a larger color space, your original file, to a smaller color space, which is the color space of the paper. Okay, so a paper, there's no fine art paper that can reproduce all the colors in a raw file, in a full modern camera raw file. So the colors have to be compressed. I can toggle between perceptual by clicking on it like that, or relative. And notice that as I click on each, I'm going to click on perceptual now, and then click on relative. You'll see that I get a slight change. And all you're doing here is pretty much deciding visually which one looks closest to the original, or which one you prefer. So again, I'm going to click on perceptual, and I'm going to click on relative. And for me, when I click on relative, I get a little bit deeper color in the background here. The color looks a little bit truer and richer to me. And so I'm going to use relative when I make a print of this image as the rendering intent. There is no formula for this, and it's an image basis, so you have to go at it image by image. There's no rule or anything like that. You have to soft proof every one of your images on the paper you want to print on, and then make a note of what the rendering intent is, because it doesn't save it anywhere. I just know that relative is the one I'm going to use for this image. So when we go into the print module here, we can set the rendering intent to relative down here. That's jumping ahead a little bit, but just keep that in mind. So we talked about the soft proofing, how to download the profiles, and how to set our rendering intent. The final step here is to set up Lightroom properly, and this applies, it's similar for other applications because, again, the concepts are the same. Things like profiles and rendering intents, those are going to be terms that are going to be the same regardless of what application you're using. It could be Photoshop. Lightroom may have them laid out a little bit differently to capture one, or maybe the UI is slightly different from Photoshop, but the terminology and the concepts are all going to be the same. I'm going to jump back into Lightroom and I'll answer your question, Dave. And also, Karen asks, what is the color management for Mac OS 16? Mac 16, we're in Mac OS 15 now, but the color management is not something that you turn on or off in the operating system. It is always on and always running. It's part of the operating system. So it's nothing that you have to really worry about. It's handled by the application. We have the option of changing what we do when we're going to make a print, but it's always working. So it's not anything that you have to really be worried about when it comes to that. And I'm just going to answer another question here. Perceptive for matte prints relative for glossy. What do you think? My experience is that the rendering intent is irrespective of the paper that you use. It has to do, remember what's going on. And I'm going to jump back in here again for a moment, okay? This is the profile for the ARCH 88 paper. Okay, so let's assume that the larger color space is ProPhoto RGB. That's what Lightroom is in, and Photoshop and so forth, and that has most of the colors of your image. But when you print onto ARCH 88, it has to fit within this color space. So any greens out here, any blues over here, any reds over here have to go inside the color space. The way that the colors get compressed, the way they get moved from outside of the destination space being ARCH 88, the way they get moved inside of the destination space is called the rendering intent. That's what the rendering intent is. So you can see here how that is not going to be, it's not really reliant on the kind of paper that you're using. It's determined by the colors that are in your image, right? If you've got an image that has lots of reds or greens or what have you, that's going to give you a different rendering intent, or potentially different rendering intent, than an image that is very monotone perhaps, or just has very muted colors. So I almost never have thought of rendering intent as the kind of paper. I'm thinking of it as, what are the colors that I have in this particular image, and how are they going to be compressed, moved into the smaller color space? As an example, Let me turn on Prestige, and I'm going to fade back Arch 88. And actually, I had to fade back Prestige. I'm sorry, because Prestige is the larger color space. So let's fade back Prestige. There we go. Somehow this is not working for me now. Let's turn this one off. There we go. Okay. So these are the color spaces of Arch 88 and Baryta Prestige. And you can see that Prestige is a larger color space than Arch 88. And so theoretically, right, Prestige is going to reproduce more vivid color than Arch 88 is, because you can see that when it comes to the reds and the blues, Prestige is out here, Arch 88 is over here. Look at the greens, okay? And also look at the Dmax, right? Dmax is how much black a paper can hold. Notice that Arch 88 ends over here and Prestige continues down here. And that's no surprise there. We know that Prestige has more Dmax. The reason why this doesn't automatically suggest that you use Prestige for all of your prints is because a paper is more than just the amount of color it can hold. There's also the reflectivity and the texture and the finish and the kind of the feel that it gives the viewer. And so even though Prestige technically is always going to give me more color, number one, I don't know if the image that I'm printing can actually take advantage of the color that Prestige can give me. And number two, I may prefer Arch 88 for its texture and its feel and what it imbues the print with, even if I know that I'm losing a little bit of the potential color that I would get with Prestige, because Arch 88 is a totally different look and feel of paper than Baryta Prestige is. But just to give you a sense here of what's going on in terms of conceptually, okay? Okay, I'm going to switch back and so how do we set up Lightroom and set up the printer driver? Well, let's jump into Lightroom again. I'm going to go into the print module and actually, let me go back again to my presentation just for a moment. I just want to discuss two concepts here. The first concept is there are two ways to print. Okay, one is called color managed or application managed, and one is called non-managed. We've been talking here about a color managed workflow. That means that the application, Lightroom, is handling the colors. A non-managed workflow, or what's known as a printer managed workflow, means that the printer handles the conversion of the colors. And generally speaking, we don't want to use that method of printing because you're leaving it up to chance. You're relying on the printer to make the right decisions to convert the colors properly for the paper. You may get a good looking print, but you can't be sure that you're always going to be consistent in the colors that you get. In a color managed workflow, you are using the profile for the paper. In a non-managed workflow, you are not using the profile. So just to point out those two different ways, and everything we've been talking about so far involves a color managed workflow. Now, in a color managed workflow, in terms of setting up Lightroom and your printer, there are three critical settings. The first setting is that you must select the profile in Lightroom. All right. If you don't have a profile selected in Lightroom, then Lightroom can't manage the color because it doesn't know how to transfer the colors, how to translate the colors to the printer based on the paper that you're using. So that's critical step number one. You have to make sure you select the profile. The second step is to make sure that you turn off color management in the printer. Now, I mentioned before, just to keep things clear, that the color management in the operating system is always on. We're not talking about that. We're talking about in the printer driver for your particular printer, whether it's Canon or Epson, there's an option to turn off color management. And you want to turn that off so that the printer doesn't interfere with the printing and the color translation that's handled by Lightroom because we've selected a profile in Lightroom. And then the last step is you want to make sure that you select the correct media type in the printer driver as well. The media type tells the printer what kind of paper you're using, whether it's a matte paper, whether it's a glossy paper, whether it's a thick or thin paper. And it also tells the printer something a little bit about the paper so that it can put, it can vary the amount of black ink that it puts down. Now, I had mentioned before, in terms of the media type, that's something that will be provided by the paper manufacturer. So Canson, in this case, will tell you what media type to use in either an Epson or a Canon printer to make sure that the paper gets is optimized for the printer. And I'll show you that now, specifically in Lightroom and in the printer driver. So I mentioned the first step is to make sure that you select the profile in Lightroom. And you do that here in the print job area. And down here, you'll see that I have an option to select the profile, just like we did in the soft proof. By the way, someone had asked about soft proof. Yes, if we're in the develop module, you press S, takes you into soft proof. S brings you out of soft proof. And if you press S to go into soft proof, then you press Y to get the before and after, or the original image and the proofed version. In the print module, again, we have this area where you can see it says here color management. Notice that we can set this to managed by printer. That means that we are now using a printer managed workflow. Lightroom is no longer managing the color. And generally speaking, you don't want to do this because then you're leaving it up to chance. You're letting the printer kind of decide what the color should be. We want to manage the color using profiles. And so I'm going to select the profile. I'm going to select R88. And then right below that, you see that I have now a choice of which rendering intent to use. And because we determined in the soft proofing that we would use relative, I'm going to select relative here. You don't see a change here. You only see that change when you're soft proofing. But this is the rendering intent, meaning how the color is going to be compressed from the larger color space to the profile that we're using for Arch88, which is the profile supplied by Canson. Okay, now here on the right, I'll hide my camera for a second. I'll just move this over a little bit. Here you see print settings, and I'm going to click on print settings. And this is where we can adjust the printer driver. Now, one more thing to keep in mind, and that is that even though we're still in Lightroom, when we click on print settings, we're working in the printer driver. So we're not really in Lightroom. This is just a window that opens on top of Lightroom, but we're really working in the printer driver itself. And that's a Canon, this is Canon software. If I switch to Epson, I have an Epson P800 here. If I switch to that, then we'll get adjustments for an Epson printer. So let's go back to Canon for a moment. I'll do Epson as well. For Canon, I mentioned that we need to do two things here. We need to make sure that color management is off and that we're using the correct media type. So we come down to printer options here. And by the way, if you're on a Windows machine, this is all accessed through page setup. Everything is just combined into one window, whereas on the Mac, we have two separate windows, one to lay out the size of the paper and then one to set up the printer. And that's where I clicked on print settings to get this window here. We come down here to quality and media. I click here on the eye. This is very confusing, but this software is designed by Canon and Epson. So this could be much better, I agree, but this is what we're stuck with for now. So here you see that we can decide the media type to use. And typically, you'll see different papers in here that are Canon papers. Okay, and to determine which paper to use, again, I'm going to go back to the Canson website. When you download the profile for your printer, you'll see here, it'll tell you which media type to use. Now, sometimes you will see an actual paper here. So something like high density fine art paper. And that means that what that means is to use that media type in the Canon driver. So if I come back over here, that would mean I would go here to fine art papers, highest density fine art paper. And that's the correct media type would be for whatever paper you were using. There are some Canon printers that allow you to update or add custom media types to the printer driver. The Pro 1100, which I'm using now, does allow you to do that. So for example, if it does, you'll see that Canson will provide us with what's called an AM1X file. And this is a file that you download and you can actually add that exact paper to the printer driver. So that now when you go to select the media type, instead of selecting the compatible media type from Canon, you can actually choose a Canson paper. Now this is only for Canon printers. This is not available for Epson printers, because, well, Epson wants you to use their papers only. So you can use Canson papers, of course, but you have to select the compatible media type. But if your Canon printer supports AM1X files, you can download this file. You can use Canon software called the Media Configuration Tool. That's a software that comes with Canon printers, to add this file to your Canon printer. And when that happens, you'll see here that now, instead of choosing one of Canon's papers, I can come down to custom and I can actually select one of Canson's papers. And so here's BFK. I actually don't have the R88 installed yet, but let's assume that I did. It would be here. Let's say here's BFK. If I was printing onto BFK, then I would use the media type BFK. Of course, I would change the profile over here to BFK as well. And then you want to make sure that the color management is off. And how do I know it's off here? Because here you see rendering intent is grayed out. Rendering intent means manage colors, and I can't click on anything here. So grayed out means that it's not doing any color management. Lightroom is doing the color management. Print quality, of course, you can set this to highest. That just means you're going to get the best quality out of the printer, and I can choose my feed, whether it's the back of the printer or the top. For matte papers, you want to use the manual feed. That's what Canon recommends. Now, if I switch to an Epson printer here, then we have the same settings or similar settings. Here are printer settings for the Epson. Click on the little eye here, and you'll see here that it's slightly different window, but the concepts are the same, right? We want to choose our media type. And if I go back to Canson website again, let's say that I choose Epson this time, and I choose P800. That's the printer that I have, my Epson printer. Now you'll see that you get the actual Epson media type that we should use. So for example, for Arch88, it's velvet fan art paper. For BFK Reeves, if I were using that, it's velvet fan art paper. It's the same. So I'm going to come back to Lightroom. This time I'm going to choose here in the media type, I'm going to set this to fine art paper, velvet fine art. But you'll notice that they are grayed out. And the reason why they're grayed out can be frustrating, but it's fairly straightforward or fairly simple if you know what's going on. And the reason it's grayed out is because I have chosen in the Epson driver the sheet feeder, and you cannot feed matte papers in the sheet feeder. They must be fed into the front feed. So Epson restricts you in terms of the kind of paper that you use and where it can be fed. So if I change the sheet feeder to front fine art, now when I go to media type and come down to fine art paper, you'll see that now the velvet fine art is available for me or for us. So now I've got the correct media type set. And once again, I come down to color mode right here. And this is set to Epson standard sRGB. What does this mean? It means, remember what I showed you before in terms of the color spaces, it means that Epson is going to print this image in the sRGB color space. If I were to leave it the way it is right now, we would be doing what's called double profiling, which is never going to give you good results. What's happening here is that I have a profile set in Lightroom, but I'm also telling Epson to use the sRGB color space and do its own color conversion. We're double profiling, which is never going to give you good results. So remember the 3 critical steps: make sure you have a profile in your software, make sure that you have the right media type, and make sure that color management is off in the printer driver. So I'm going to change this to off, no color management. Now we're only profiling once. Lightroom is doing the profiling, the color management. All right. And then here, once again, output resolution is the same as quality in Canon. I'm going to set this to highest here. That just gives us the best quality. And everything else here is pretty minor. I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to hit save. And that's pretty much it, that in terms of making sure that you're going to get accurate color. Everything else having to do with laying out the print and all that is just a function of how you want your print to look. But in terms of color management, those are the key critical steps there. I'm going to switch back to, I'm going to cover one more thing. And that is that lastly, right, you want to make sure or ensure that when you evaluate your print, that you do it with consistent lighting. So if you don't have any type of fancy lighting, make sure that the light is the same all the time so that you have references that you can trust. But if you can make one good improvement, that would be to get some kind of a viewing light that gives you a nice pure spectrum light, meaning that it's not going to be too cool or too warm. It's going to give you all the colors of the visible spectrum, and it's going to give you some nice ambient lighting, something like the Ilford, I guess pronounced Ilfalux color viewing lamp. This is a pretty nice light that some students that I have this light and they really like it, and it's fairly inexpensive, about $100 on B&H or Amazon. You can get something more expensive like a viewing station. That's going to be more money, but that'll give you a better reference. But some basic lighting that you can have close by so that now you know that every time you look at a print, you are evaluating it with the same kind of lighting, which would allow you to make more objective decisions about where the colors are and what you are looking for and how closely it matches your monitor. Lastly, I just want to say a little bit about matching your print to your screen. Some of us can get a little obsessive about that, or we might think that the goal is to match the print to the screen 100%. And I can tell you right now that that will never happen. The reason it will never happen has to do with the fact that we're comparing paper to a monitor. Those are two different mediums. And number two, the paper adds a whole different dimension, particularly an amazing, beautiful paper like a Canson paper adds a beautiful dimension to your image. And my philosophy behind this is that you should, of course, you want it to match as closely as possible so that the colors are true to your vision. But at the end of the day, the print should stand on its own. No one is going to evaluate your print next to your monitor. If you show your prints to someone or you hang them in a gallery or in a museum, no one's going to have the monitor next to it saying, wait a second, the red is not exactly the same red on your monitor. The idea is, does the print stand on its own? Does it convey the story that you want to share? And does the paper add something? Does it bring its own textural and dimensional element to the print? And if you have a really good color managed system like what I've shown you here, and you take advantage of the aesthetic properties of the paper, then you're not so much looking anymore to have an exact match on screen. You're looking to create something that you feel is representative of your creative vision, your creative efforts. All right, so we've got a couple questions that I can just get into. I'm assuming that Capture One has similar controls to Lightroom, although I can't promise that they're identical. One of the reasons that I use Lightroom is because the printing and the color management is so straightforward and gives you all the options that you need to make sure that your colors are reproduced faithfully. That's nothing against Capture One. I'm just not 100% sure of all the adjustments, but any good software should have at least the basic adjustments like profiling, soft proofing, etc. Do you have a printout of the amount of color space for each of the papers? I don't have a printout because, once again, just because a paper can reproduce a certain number of colors doesn't mean that all those colors are going to be representative in your image. You know, you can make an image of a landscape that has lots of greens in it, and there are very few reds at all, if any. Maybe you have a cloudy sky where you don't have a lot of blues. And so my experience has been that images tend to have a much smaller color space than what is actually possible. Uh, you can have maybe fireworks where you have lots of different colors. That's a good example of having many, many different colors, but that's a very rare and unique kind of an image. But generally speaking, I think it's just a question of experimenting. Is it possible? So here's the question: is it possible why R-Shade 8 is better for black and white than Prestige or other paper? Well, yes, my feeling is that a black and white image is not just about the amount of Dmax. So Prestige is going to give you more contrast, no doubt about it. But sometimes you're looking for an image or a print to say something different. You're looking for something that's quiet or more subdued or more reserved or more more abstract, more fine art. In which case, a Prestige, which is going to be very aggressive and beautiful for some things, may give the wrong impression, may give maybe wrong is the wrong word, will give a different interpretation of what you're looking for from a creative standpoint. What do you think about the print rips, Mirage? Well, Lightroom is essentially a rip. Rips were used in the past because you could adjust the way you print it onto paper. And before Lightroom, we had Photoshop, and Photoshop was kind of limited for printing. You could just print one image at a time onto a piece of paper. And so a rip gave you many different options for putting multiple images onto a piece of paper, etc. Lightroom does all of that. So yes, I do 100% of my printing in Lightroom, I guess with the rare exception of Photoshop, but that's extremely rare, and that has more to do with testing things out than looking for the best possible quality of a print. And then Rob Sutton, is the best practice to print directly from your editing software rather than exporting your image and then printing from, say, Canon Professional Print Layout? Well, again, Canon Professional Print Layout is a software that Canon provides to print your images. If you think about it from a marketing standpoint, if you're selling a printer, it seems pretty reasonable, pretty smart to include some software that allows you to print on that printer. But I don't think that takes the place of an application like Lightroom, where not only can you print exactly the way you can print in Canon software, but you also, it contains your entire workflow from input all the way to output. So for me personally, I like to keep things under one roof, as it were. It allows me to make sure that everything is efficient. I'm not exporting and running the risk of, misconfiguring something, etc. I know many artists who print their work, and many print studios who print professionally, and they use either Photoshop or Lightroom. They both use the same engine, so to speak, under the hood. Lightroom is just designed more for people who are working with raw images, whereas Photoshop is more for, basically everything else, right? A lot of commercial type of compositing and things like that. But if you're a photographer working with raw images, I would suggest that you will be able to control the whole workflow much more efficiently and much more powerfully, much more creatively, when you really go deep on one piece of software and learn it inside out. All right, so if there aren't any other questions, looking here, I think that pretty much does it. Oh, there was a question about printing to black and white back at the beginning. And the thing I will say about that is that I still use Canson profiles when I'm printing a black and white image, even though it's a black and white image, and even though it's a color profile, but the profile, again, handles how to interpret the colors or lack of colors, and also the tonal range. And the reason why I like to use Lightroom with the color profile to print black and white is because, number one, again, it keeps my workflow consistent and the same. You'll get a neutral image. It's not like it's going to add a warm or a cooling effect to your image. It'll be neutral gray. However, if you decide that you want to add some toning to the image in Lightroom, so if you want to tone your image in Lightroom, like add some sepia tone or some cool tone to the shadows to create kind of a silver gelatin print, that kind of thing. You can add a tiny bit of toning, and that toning, not only can you see it on screen, not only can you preview it, but then you can also print that and you'll get that toning in the print. So if you don't do any toning, you'll get a neutral gray image with a good profile. And I have to reiterate here that Canson's profiles are really, really good because they've been done with the idea that you want to get the most out of the paper. So there's no reason why Canson wouldn't provide you with the best possible profiles so that you can really appreciate and get everything out of the papers that they promise and they do deliver. So I still use the profile. There is a way to print without using the profile and letting the printer manage the color in black and white, as it were. And that can give you decent results or good results. But again, my preference and what I recommend is to use the color profile. And when you get really comfortable, then you can experiment, of course. And that's always a lot of fun. Always experiment, always try different things, regardless of what I say. All right. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining me today. All your questions were great. I hope that was clear and insightful. You can always repeat it again, review it again when you get the replay. If there's anything I missed or anything that you think could be better explained, please send me an email. You can find that about me at creativepathworkshops.com, where I offer online courses and a subscription service for photographers that want to go in depth and learn on a regular basis. And you can also send me an email directly, and I'll be happy to answer your questions, or send an email to Canson as well, and they'll respond equally as well. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate it. See you next time.